Shortly after the great financial crisis blew up, Queen Elizabeth II visited the London School of Economics, and she asked the assembled professors why no one had seen something so big coming. It's a question about early warning. And it's a good question. And it's an instance of a theme which runs through this whole sorry saga, which is of women asking the penetrating questions. She was told that some had raised concerns, but that none had been clear on the critical issue of timing. It's a remarkably disassociated answer, because no one, not even those professors, would accept an answer which said concerns had been raised about the Titanic, but no one had been clear on the critical issue of exactly when it would hit the iceberg. And having given her that poor answer, the profession then entirely lost interest in the question. Instead, it turned its attention to figuring out exactly what the causes of that crisis had been and which structural reforms to implement in order to prevent its recurrence. But everyone knows about generals losing wars by preparing to fight the last one. Her question deserves a proper answer. Not because it's posed by a woman, not because it's posed by the Queen of England, but because implicitly she is posing that question on behalf of the world. I have attempted to provide a full answer to that question. Not primarily as a matter of historical record, but in order to get to the concern that lies at the heart of her question, which is that we might in future once again lack for early warning. And I draw on the fact that early warning not only failed in the context of the great financial crisis, it also failed in the context of the euro crisis and in the context of the ongoing crisis in China. And there are lessons to draw from all three of these failures. What follows now is a selection and summary from the full presentation, a link to which is provided at the end. In short, global early warning can and must be fixed. And those of us working on this project need your help to make it happen. You can find how to get involved in the Next Steps section of the full presentation. I'm going to talk about global early warning. Now I mean global, not international, and I mean catastrophes, not the business cycle. Though the issues are completely macroeconomic in nature, I find that they're introduced most effectively in a completely non-economic setting. So, in 1987, in the United Kingdom, there was a hurricane.
Earlier on today, apparently a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that...
Those 15 seconds convey all the substantive points that I want to make about the state of the macroeconomics profession in the context of the great financial and the ongoing Euro and Chinese crises. There's his tone of voice. He is completely arrogant, smug, and free of doubt. And the fact that in those 15 seconds he's got time to mention the gender of his caller is significant also. Because, at least to my knowledge, the first person to correctly call that there was risk of a great financial crisis was a woman, Brooksley Bourne, who made her call in the mid-1990s, fully 15 years ahead of time. And she was dismissed just as this caller was dismissed. If you've forgotten the Michael Fish moment of macroeconomics, let me just remind you of it. This is the IMF's World Economic Outlook for July of 2007, where they conclude that the strong global expansion is continuing, with risks modestly tilted to the downside. At this point in the discussion, if I'm presenting to audiences of economists, I typically encounter vigorous pushback. They argue that early warning is simply impossible. Instead, I point out that, to the contrary, we know rather a lot about what causes crises. We know that if all these three things are interacting, so you have mispricing of risk, a suboptimal currency union, and the centre of political gravity is not willing to do whatever it takes, then you have a real witch's brew. Here, of course, I'm describing the euro. And the point is that we not only know these things, but we know these things with a very high degree of certainty. They are not rough guesses. How should one characterize these crises? Well, in my view, the best way to think of them conceptually is as accidents waiting to happen. And the profession has successfully called these global crises, including all three of the most recent of those. But, as with Michael Fish, the official institutions of global early warning failed to make these calls. So, as in his case, the appropriate response is not to despair of the underlying science. It is to go back and reconsider the conduct of these official institutions of global early warning. Government-controlled institutions of global early warning are inherently compromised in the execution of their task. And that is so whether or not the politicians in control are venal. Simply by virtue of being official, there are so many slippery slopes down which they slide, the cumulative effect of which is to raise the burden of proof before they call a global crisis well above what is warranted by the underlying science. Think about this a little more. Because what was the great financial crisis at root? It was mispricing of risk. What was and is the euro area crisis at root? It is a suboptimal currency union. And what was and is the China crisis at root? It is whatever it takes being awry. And these three accidents were all waiting to happen simultaneously, interacting with one another. So when I point out that the G20 controlled institutions of global early warning failed to call these crises, I'm not accusing them of having failed to call esoterica, things akin to butterflies flapping their wings in China. Instead, I'm pointing out that they failed to call quintessentially classic crises. This, therefore, is a measure of how high these institutions raise the burden of proof before they call crises. They raise the burden of proof so high that they do not even call quintessentially classic crises. The task of global early warning cannot be addressed within the universe of G20 controlled institutions. It has to be addressed outside of that universe. So the obvious question is, okay, how do you do that and how do you make it happen? And there is a final, critical point about the substance of good global early warning work. It is that such work must expressly be a time-free zone. Economics knows a very great deal about the causes of global catastrophes, but it knows next to nothing about the lag between the gestation of such problems and their materialization. Accordingly, this enterprise should be initiated and led by a syndicate of institutions, some 50 of which already exist worldwide, known as independent fiscal institutions. Of these, the Congressional Budget Office in the United States is the biggest and best known. But alongside, the Office for Budget Responsibility in the United Kingdom, the network of independent fiscal institutions in the European Union, and the parliamentary budget offices in Canada, Australia, South Africa and elsewhere are also well known. Granted, their founding purpose was not to supply global risk analysis. Instead, it was to supply various forms of domestic fiscal analysis. Nevertheless, and despite the variation in their mandates, all of them are required in some shape or form to supply analysis of the principal risks confronting their domestic fiscal institutions. And as we have seen, particularly in the last couple of decades, by far the greatest source of such risk is the global environment. The independent fiscal institutions have been well aware of this fact. But their approach to date to analysis of global risks as input into their domestic fiscal work has left much to be desired. They need to upgrade substantially their approach to analysis of global risks. Were the independent fiscal institutions to cooperate with one another formally as a syndicate on an ongoing basis to supply global risk analysis on the basis of the proposals of the substance for that which I have outlined, motivated entirely by their domestic fiscal mandates, that would, almost as a byproduct, provide an answer for how to supply the public good of effective global early warning. This is how to get effective global early warning supplied and paid for. Let me label the ongoing collaboration I'm proposing between the independent fiscal institutions, non-G20 governments and others as the Global Macrofinancial Risk Council. In addition to the proposals I've made regarding its substance and form, a further aspect of its work is critical. That is advocacy, persistent advocacy. Global early warning requires persistence. And finally, once when I was making my case inside an independent fiscal institution, the question came back to me, why not just fix the IMF? As it goes at national level, so it goes at international level. Because at the end of the day, what is the IMF? It is merely a collection of ministries of finance. And just as those suffer from various political and other biases at national level, so those problems all reappear when the ministries are pooled together at international level in the IMF. The Global Macrofinancial Risk Council that I am proposing, led by the independent fiscal institutions, is the fix for the IMF. And the particular bias there that the Risk Council is correcting is the propensity of such G20-controlled institutions to set the burden of proof before global crisis is called far above what is warranted by the state of knowledge of the profession. And so, to sum up, this work must be global, not international. Global catastrophes have their origin in the policies and policy frameworks of the G20. They should be the absolute focus and priority of this work. There are limitations to what early warning, even at its best, can achieve. By far, the most significant of those limitations concerns time. The profession has absolutely no idea of the lag between the gestation and manifestation of crisis. This work should expressly embrace that constraint. So, if the underlying dangers persist, it should be utterly fearless in repeating itself ad nauseam and entirely unimpressed by the passage of many years without crisis. These limitations acknowledged, by far the greater danger is to understate the scope for early warning. We know a lot about what causes crisis, and we should be held to account for it. Moreover, the point is not to call crises. It is to call fixes, and minimally sufficient fixes at that. So for the most part, we will not find ourselves calling for fixes which turn the world on its head, but for minimal fixes with potentially enormous payoffs. We should have the courage of our convictions. There is a clutter of institutions now working on global early warning. But they are all G20 controlled. And that fundamentally and deeply compromises their conduct of this work. That leaves a critical gap in the international financial architecture, which the Global Macrofinancial Risk Council is needed to fill. Its fundamental purpose is to lower the standard of proof required before a crisis is called back down to what is warranted by the state of knowledge of the profession. All of this will require new substance, new form, and new advocacy in early warning. And if we will not undertake these steps now, when will we do so? The global economy is in a dire state in the wake of the great financial and the ongoing Euro and Chinese crises. Should one or other of these accidents waiting to happen flare up again, we are all but out of macroeconomic ammunition with which to respond. Early warning is the only game left in town. And if the independent fiscal institutions, acting collectively, in order to meet their domestic mandates, will not lead this effort, then who will do it?